Good evening and welcome to ADA New South Wales Live. The broadcast will commence at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. This evening's discussion explores the important topic of stress, strain and burnout in the dental profession and will feature an esteemed panel of professionals who will discuss the key findings of recent research published in this area. You will be able to type your questions and comments to the panel throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to participate. Please remember to keep your questions or comments brief and professional. This broadcast is proudly provided to you as a member service by ADA New South Wales.
Hello, good evening and welcome to ADA New South Wales Live. I'm Patrick Meaney, your host for this evening's webcast, and ADA Q&A, if you will. Our subject is stress, strain and burnout amongst New South Wales and ACT dentists. For those of you viewing this broadcast online, I'd encourage you to interact with us here this evening at St Leonard's using the chat box next to your video window. Please note that you don't need to log in. Simply select the chat without logging in option, and when you type your first question, we'll see it. We ask you to keep your questions and comments brief, to the point and professional. We'll do our best to deal with as many as we can throughout the evening. In preparing for tonight, the thought did occur to me that all of the graduates of fine universities and their dental courses here with us tonight, in person and online, might have inadvertently confused our topic with a dissertation on material science and be ready for a discussion of Hooke's law. I know that many of you could probably recite the standard definitions of stress and its sleeping partner strain as though you were all back in first year. If you're nodding your head right now, it's a good idea to reconsider tonight's discussion and its likely parameters. And I'll give you a hint, they're not likely to include references to the modulus of elasticity or in fact any physics whatsoever. To help you out, I did a little internet research, but the web is surprisingly silent on most forms of stress to do with dentists. The best description I found of the sorts of stress I suffer at work was by the ubiquitous internet author Anon, who wrote that stress is best understood as the confusion created when one's mind overrides the body's basic desire to choke the living daylights out of someone who desperately needs it. You could also consider the words of American author Richard Carlson, who observed that stress is nothing more than a socially acceptable form of mental illness. Or you may, as dentists, be drawn to the words of American television chef and author Sandra Lee, don't worry, I don't know who she was either, who observed, "How do I cope with stress? I clean and I organise," which does resonate, although that really sounds more like my DA. Tonight, we'll be looking at many of these stresses and strains in some detail, stresses that affect us all in our day-to-day lives as dentists. And so to our guests. Dr. Robin John's interest in the dental profession comes from having spent more than 20 years employed in a variety of dental settings prior to her research career. She initially worked within the private sector as a dental assistant and a practice manager, later qualifying as dental therapist, working within the New South Wales public health system, providing care to children and adolescents. In 1997, Robin embarked on business studies and later graduated with honours, majoring in human resource management and industrial relations. Following graduation, Robin pursued a career in human resource management, working for large multinational enterprises before transitioning into academia. Since that transition, Robin has completed her PhD, and despite having left the dental profession, she's always maintained strong links and networks within the profession. Her practical insight and understanding of the dental profession, combined with her academic experience, places her in a unique position to make a significant contribution to research within the field. And I urge you all to give her a warm welcome here tonight. Also on our panel to discuss and interpret Robin's findings are two dentists, Dr. Peter Norton and Dr. Pamela Gower. Peter is a graduate of a foreign university. He graduated from South Australia, the Adelaide University, in 2004, but thanks to APRA, he is able to legally practice in New South Wales. He was awarded the Health Partners Prize for Dental Clinical Practice in 2002 and the Australian Society of Prosthodontists Prize for Prosthetic Dentistry in 2004, as well as being admitted to the Dean's List of the Adelaide Dental School. Peter juggles an active social life with sporting interests and involvement in the performing arts, as well as having a very busy professional life, and we'll find out how stressful it is working in 4 separate dental practices. Pam Gower graduated with me in Sydney University in 1983 with a Bachelor of Dental Surgery, and commenced work as a private practitioner in Kareela, in Sydney's southern suburbs. In 1994, she graduated from the University of Melbourne with a diploma in forensic odontology, and currently splits her time between her private practice in Kareela, where she sees her live patients, and the Department of Forensic Medicine in Glebe, colloquially known as the City Morgue, where she sees dead people. Pam is the recipient of the Humanitarian Overseas Service Medal, a Fellow of the Pierre Fauchot Academy, and a Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists in Australia, and welcome to you both. I think it was American comedian Lily Tomlin who said, "Reality is the leading cause of stress among those in touch with it." We'll see if we can find out a bit more about stress, strain and burnout in our profession as we asked Dr. Robin Johns about her study. Robin, before we get to the meat of your findings, tell us a little about how you came to be interested in this topic.
Well, as you alluded to earlier, I was actually working in the dental profession, and I then transitioned into academia, and I was at an international conference. I was actually in Tokyo, where I had at that point started my PhD on a completely different topic. But I was sitting there listening to what people had to say on the topic I had initially embarked on, and I was thinking this is almost impossible to make a unique contribution in this area. So I walked out in frustration and went into a completely different room where they were talking about stress. And as I sat there, I thought, wow, what does this mean for dentists? Because having had that background. So I raced back to my hotel room, jumped on the internet and started Googling. And as you've discovered, there really isn't a lot there when we look at stress for dentists. So that's where it all started from.
What did you do then when you got back to Australia? How did you go about uncovering
Yeah,
our problems?
so I started having a look at what research had been done previously and found there was very little that had occurred here in Australia. And what had been done looked at the outcomes of stress. But given I'm combining my background in dentistry also with human resources, my interest in human resources is what is it about the job that brings about these stresses? So I started digging around and found, well, there really wasn't anything in Australia. And so I expanded my research to look internationally, and I found that there were people, particularly in the UK, that had looked at this very topic. So we used that as the basis in which we commenced doing some interviews, and that followed into the research.
So you've tried to make this have a correlation to other societies like ours by using the same tools that they used.
That's right. So there was a tool that was already in place that had looked at the various stressors. So they had gone about identifying what are the stresses that dentists experience in their day-to-day work. But what we said was, well, let's take a step back. This is a different environment, completely different context. So maybe what we should do is speak to some dentists first and find out, do these things remain the same here in the Australian context? So we commenced by doing some interviews, and there was, as in the report, we did 18 interviews in a variety of different settings with people. And what we did find is that a lot of the stresses that were identified in the UK research were common here in Australia, but there were some that were unique.
Now, you were telling me that your very first experience with conducting these interviews revealed something about dentists you hadn't previously suspected. Tell me about that.
When I first made just a cold call to a dentist to ask if they would be interested in participating in my interviews, he said, "Why do you want to speak to me? What do you know about us?" And I said, well, I explained to him that I was doing the research. He goes, "Yeah, but why dentists? You're not one of us." And I said, well, I have worked, my background has been in dentistry. Oh, well, that's okay then. come and talk to me. I'm happy to do that. And when I was there speaking to him, I said, had I have not worked in dentistry previously, would you have spoken to me? He said, absolutely not.
Now, Peter, you were one of Robin's first interviewees. Did you show her the handshake to demonstrate that?
I don't recall doing that, but no, look, I think I was a fairly willing participant at that stage.
You were,
but
yes.
It's interesting to hear that wasn't the entire experience.
And was that a lone experience? Did you find it sort of a collegiate us against them?
I think it was more to do with people feeling a sense of, how do I speak to you? Like, do you understand the acronyms I may use related to the profession, as opposed to, I don't want to speak to you because you're not a dentist or you haven't been involved in the profession. It was more having an understanding of the profession. Yeah.
Pam, you deal a lot with people that aren't dentists in your other professional life. Do
Yes.
you find that they regard you as being part of a secret organisation in the way that this first guy did?
No, I don't. Usually they relate to their own personal experiences at the dentist, and sometimes that's not good, so you do get branded within a group. But no, not like a secret society.
Well, that's healthy. So what happened after you had those initial interviews? What did you do with that information?
Okay, so as I said, there was an existing instrument out of the UK that had looked at the types of stresses that dentists typically experience. And so one of the things that we were interested in doing the interviews is there commonality with that? And as I mentioned before, there is, but there were some unique stressors that hadn't been identified in the UK research. And again, I think that comes back to the context here within Australia. And those stresses were associated with running a business. So obviously, a lot of dentists here in Australia, they spend a lot of time in their studies focusing on how to be a good dentist. But not so much of their time is focused on how to actually run a business. So things that were coming up in the discussions were dealing with staff, having to do their BAS, so those general sort of business administration type stressors. And they were something that hadn't come up in the UK, in the US, in other parts of Europe.
I must say, I did find that a bit surprising. So that really, we're not talking about UK exclusively tonight, or even very much at all, but they don't know how to run a business. Is that what?
Well, I think just the context is different, yeah.
Okay. When you went to the next phase, there's an ADA connection there. How did that come about?
So obviously I have people within the profession that I know, so we contacted the ADA and asked if they would be interested. And I initially spoke federally, and we discussed how it was best to run the survey, and we thought, obviously with my location here in New South Wales and a fairly large dental population here in Australia, in New South Wales, that we should commence by focusing in this state, yeah.
And you got what I think, as a layperson in this area, was a tremendous response of more than 1,000 people.
Yeah, I was certainly surprised by that. When I embarked on this, obviously it was part of my PhD studies, and my PhD supervisor said to me, okay, so to run the statistical analysis that you're after, we need to get about 400 responses. And so that's what we're really hoping for. But in fact, we had that within about, well, it was in less than a week that had come back, and we ended up with over 1,000 responses. So it was really rewarding, and it was amazing the number of dentists who actually called me once the survey went out and just said thank you. And what they were saying to me at the time is, we often get surveys sent out to us, but it's about what we do, not who we are. And so I think they appreciated that somebody was interested in what they were actually experiencing. Yeah.
And you were telling me that some of the comments that they made at the end, where you get a chance to write an essay or make a few dot points, were revealing in themselves.
Yes, or when you say essay, there was only about half a dozen lines, but many people did take it upon themselves to put in A4 pages that went for pages and pages of comments, which was, again, just showing how much they did engage with it. But yeah, there were two comments that really stood out to me. One comment went along the lines of saying that, I thank my lucky stars every day as a naive 17-year-old that I chose a fantastic profession, and I loved it when I first started, and I still love it today, and it was like 20 years later or 30 years later. And the other end of the scale was someone who said, I hated dentistry from the first day and I still hate it today, but I feel I'm trapped. And I think that really sort of summed it up, the differences.
Peter, where are you on that continuum of function and malfunction, do you think?
Look, I would like to think that I'm fairly towards the functional end of things. Look, you know, every profession has its days where you finish the day and wonder, God, what was that? But look, for the most part, I've actually really enjoyed the work that I do. I enjoy the work that I get to do with with people. I mean, that's part of being the dentist. So, look, for me, I would say that I'm probably towards the white fluffy clouds end of being grateful for moving into a profession that I've been very happy with.
Peter's quite young, isn't he, Pam? How would you? How would you interpret your position on that continuum?
Yes, I think I'm right up at the happy end too. I mean, I was one of these unusual people who put dentistry first and medicine second because I really wanted to do dentistry. Yes, I still enjoy it. I think if you can, manage to do a level that's comfortable for you, you can have too much dentistry and it can become very difficult. But I think that if you manage how much you do and what you do in the rest of your time too, I think it can be a really good profession. I think, as Robin said too, we're not taught to be business people, and I've often thought if I wanted to do that I would have done something else, but I did dentistry and I find the rest of it rather tedious, I'm afraid.
The business end
the business management,
yes. I think that's a very common thought. So, Robin, tell us about what you found in general. First of all, we will talk about that, obviously, but is what you found what you expected to find?
So certainly, as I said, I was interested to find the business stresses, and going back to, he said, why do I think that wasn't necessarily discovered in other parts of the world? And maybe it's because, in part, to some extent, that could be the bias that I bring to the study now, having been working in a business faculty in a university. Obviously, that is of an interest to me. But, I certainly didn't prompt for those responses. People, straight away, when I said to them, when I started those interviews, I'd say, what do you understand stress to be? What are some of the typical stresses? And pretty much in every one of those interviews, people would jump straight to talking about staffing issues and running a business, as opposed to moving into the difficulties associated with patients.
Okay, well, let's talk about what you found. And you divided those into a number of different areas. Could you take us through the key findings? So
the research out of the UK actually picked up on what they referred to as time and scheduling pressures as being quite influential in that stress space, and that was certainly something that came out in my research as well. So following on after talking about the business-related stresses, it typically then flowed into conversations of people saying, I've got people in the waiting room, or somebody turns up late for an appointment, and the flow-on effects associated with that. So a lot of it then turned to those time and scheduling pressures. The other one that I found interesting was around patients' perceptions of dentists. So many of the dentists spoke to me about how they were perceived within their community. So I can remember a couple of dentists talking about, one dentist on the North Shore speaking about how when she first started working there, she had, her car she'd had at university, and how people knew that she was driving that car and said, you mustn't be a very good dentist because you don't have a good car. So she felt the pressure to then go and upgrade her car because of the perceptions associated with that. So there was certainly a lot of discussions from people about how they were perceived, and that also extended into taking holidays. So for instance, when people said they'd take time off, people would ring up and say, oh, well, no wonder our dental treatment's so expensive because you're heading off to Europe, and things along those lines. So that sort of perceptions was quite strong and made for some very interesting discussions.
Now, in relation to that, dental-specific job demands, running behind schedule, coping with difficult uncooperative patients, patients having a medical emergency, the surgery, dissatisfied patients, possibility of making mistakes, all of those sort of things seem to me to be things that you might feel. I suppose the medical emergency is a real thing, but a lot of the time you found that dentists were thinking about the relationship between their job and the patient rather than the patient complaining about them. So doing a good job, for instance, is not something everyone just expects that dentists do a good job, but dentists don't think we do a good job.
No, that in fact they are often very critical on themselves, and many spoke about the need for always striving to achieve perfection. and that being a stressor in itself, that constant striving. And when you look at stressful occupations, it tends to be associated with those high-skilled professions. And I guess that leads into where we often hear discussions. As soon as I tell people that I'm researching in the area of stress, straight away they'll say, oh, dentists have the highest suicide rates. And again, often one of the reasons associated with high suicide rates is to do with a high-skilled occupation. But in fact, within Australia, we don't have any figures associated with occupational suicide, so that's not something we can actually verify.
So that's not true.
Not
that's
true?
stuff that people continually throw in our
Well,
face.
not as far as I'm aware. Certainly, there's been they do keep statistics in the US, and in the most recent research that I went back and double-checked, I think it was in 2012, dentists came in third behind doctors in front of them, or medicine, and I think it could have been electricians as number one.
I wouldn't have picked that, and I don't suppose we've got time to talk about that tonight. I noticed in your introduction to job stress that you said that there was a link between job design, job strain, and adverse physiological and psychological health outcomes. My question would be, is anyone actually designing dentistry as a job?
Well, I guess really that takes us back right to what got me interested in this study to begin with, because as I said, so much of the research that looks at stress, strain and burnout, where it has occurred in dentistry, looks and then tends to focus on the outcomes. So the fact that there might be increased drug use, alcohol abuse, divorce rates, cardiovascular disease, these are all outcomes of the stress, but nobody was taking that step back in an attempt to understand what is it about the job. So I guess the first part of this study was really about trying to identify, well, what is it that's causing the stress, because we can't really look at designing the job if we don't know what it is that's causing it to begin with.
We might break there and ask if there are any questions from our audience here at St Leonard's tonight. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question. Would the panellists like to address the question of professional isolation amongst dentists, sole practitioners, because that seems to be relevant to tonight's issues?
Did you find in your study that there was a statistical reflection of that?
Certainly one of the questions that was originally developed out of the UK picks up on that very point around social isolation. And people did get there and speak about it, but when it came through in the actual survey, it wasn't as strong as what I thought it would have been. But certainly in the discussions, many people, particularly if they were solo practitioners, brought up the issue about not having someone to share experiences with. So it was certainly mentioned, but it didn't come through, and that was probably one of the surprises for me. I thought it would have been higher as well.
Pam, you're a sole practitioner, or?
No, I work with other dentists too, and yes, I think I need their support, and I like their support. It makes it a nice workplace.
Peter?
Look, I agree. I would feel significant isolation working in a solo practice, I think. I'm quite lucky to have, in all 4 practices I work with, really supportive colleagues who I can bounce things off of. There are also social networking groups that I belong to of dentists, which sounds like a blast, but no, it's actually a really nice way to share experiences and try to find solutions to problems.
I guess, Peter, I know that you're a member of some Facebook groups that are devoted to dentistry, and to me that's one of the biggest shifts, say, in the last, between when I was your age and the age that I am unfortunately at now, that there are people in huge communities, 600 and 700 people on some of these groups, where it's all out there. They're talking and they're showing their cases and they're getting feedback. Not all high quality, I've got to say, but is that an important support mechanism for you, do you think?
I think it is. I think it's really good that there is some element of warts and all on those sorts of groups, because anyone can have a really good case and feel they want to brag about it, but I think we all learn a lot more from those times when perhaps things didn't go to plan, and the fact that we can incorporate that vicarious experience, I think is pretty valuable for professional development and just avoiding a sense of professional isolation.
Robin, perhaps we should at this point just go back to TORS, because we've been throwing around stress and strain, stressors and whatever the other word is for strains, and tell us what you mean by those things.
Yes, it's actually interesting that you just said, stress, strain, because a lot of people think that they're often one of the same, and there is a distinction between it. So stress tends to be this reaction, well, what we're looking when we're looking at occupational stress is the reaction to demands within your job. And so, it's something that's happening within the environment at the time. The stress occurs because of that demand, but once that demand's gone, the stress leaves. But when we're looking at anxiety, the difference is that it's prolonged. And sometimes when you start talking about anxiety, people don't always know what's brought on that anxiety, and it's something that tends to be much more chronic. So there is that difference between stress and anxiety, and certainly one of the things that we were looking at was the relationship between, to what extent is something a stress and then that leaves once that stress is gone, or is there a relationship to something more long term?
So when you're looking at things like smoking, that's a behavioural strain, and we're not thinking about that as anything other than a reaction to what they're going through.
Stress, yeah.
One of the interesting things I thought was that, and I just can't put my finger on it, but the number of people that don't drink ever was somewhat surprising to me.
Yes, I'd have to say that surprised me as well.
What was it? Was it 22% or 29? Yeah. How do you account for that? Because when I was at university, those people didn't seem to graduate. But now it's a much more healthy society, do you believe?
Well, yeah, maybe it is that people are much more health conscious, but it was certainly something I was very surprised to see. What I would say with all of this data is that we need to be very cautious in drawing conclusions from it, because it is a one-off survey, so we always need to be cautious with cross-sectional data in drawing conclusions. But yeah, I was certainly surprised, and something that I think in follow-up research we'd look further into that.
Now, things like cardiovascular health and anxiety, that's not necessarily something that we're, as dentists, going to identify in ourselves as related to the job, because everybody gets that. So how did you sort of tease out that relationship?
So what we had was, I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at the actual job demands or the stressors, what is it that brings about the stress? That was some existing research that had commenced in the UK, and we built on that. Then what we did was we used various other instruments that have been tried and tested, which adds to the validity of the study. So we used, for instance, a very well represented survey instrument that looks at burnout, and it's one of the most widely used instruments, and that allows us to be able to make comparisons. So essentially we're comparing apples with apples rather than just sort of making up any sort of random questions. So we're looking at the relationships between things such as stress and the various dimensions of burnout with mental well-being. We also brought in, which we alluded to before, which was around social support. So to what extent does social support does it mediate the relationship with those stresses?
One of the other findings you had was that when looking at your home life and looking at your work life, that one might impact the other more than the other. What did you find?
So what we found, so we looked both ways, to the extent to which the work interferes with family and to what extent family interferes with work. And there was a significant difference between the two. In fact, the extent to which work interferes with family was significantly higher than it was the other way around.
Pam, what's been your experience over your short professional life about balancing getting to work on time and staying there too late?
It's a challenge, and that term juggling that working mothers use mainly is a really good way of describing it, because sometimes you drop the ball. And that's it. You know, I can understand why the work takes precedence, because those patients are booked in appointments, you've just got to be there. But it is very hard. I'm sure every working mother has felt that, oh my God, the birthday party, when was it, when is it, that sort of thing. And I think that when you're working in dentistry, it is so stressful, you can't think of anything else at that time.
how do you manage that relationship between your work and tell me about the 4 dental practices, Peter. Is that by choice?
It is, yeah. Look, one of them is in Armidale in northern New South Wales. I worked there for 5 years after graduation and then moved to Sydney 5 years ago. So I work in 3 practices in suburban Sydney, but still visit Armidale 1 week each month. And yeah, look, I mean, that can sometimes cause a bit of an impact on family time, social time, but you know, at the end of the day, it's. I agree with what Pam was saying. It's something that I've committed to, and so it's just something that will get done.
At this point, we might ask for any more questions from the audience. Yes, Craig.
In the advisory services, we deal with dentists who are on the receiving end of either litigation or complaints, which of themselves are very stressful episodes, but often the anxiety drags on because the matters are dragging on. Did you look at all in your study at the threat of litigation, the threat of things going wrong as being a stressor and how that impacted on dentists? And is it peculiar to our profession? Is it something that we feel more acutely than others?
Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, we initially drew on that UK research and there was no mention of litigation as a stressor within that research. But when we were doing the interviews here, it certainly came through, and that was an item that I put into the survey. So that fear of litigation certainly did shine through. Yeah.
Yeah. Ethne.
Hi. I'm just wondering if you managed to look at any differences between gender or age in the study. Did you start to see any patterns evolving?
Yeah, so we certainly did allow people to identify gender. We haven't fully fleshed that out as much as we'd like yet, but there are some differences, yes, particularly associated with that work-family interference that we spoke of before, so that tended to be higher for females than what it was for males. So, yeah, certainly something I think we need to look at much more.
Pam, I might ask you, when you've been talking with male dentists,
Yes.
when we meet up at Congress and things and we discuss deep and meaningful things, do your male colleagues complain of different things to you? Is it a unique experience being a woman in dentistry?
Oh, well, I suppose it used to be. When we graduated, there weren't nearly as many women in dentistry, and certainly not in practice. So I suppose for those in more traditional relationships where the women are responsible for the domestics and the child rearing, that it might be more difficult. But I find in speaking to my male colleagues, no, we're all facing the same issues. It's just as tough, and I don't think it makes any difference, your gender.
Tell me, having listened to Robin and some of the questions we've had so far, does it gel with your experience? Would you
absolutely.
put yourself in here?
Yes, fear of litigation, absolutely. You sort of practice very defensively. And reading your list of stressors, I could have ticked every box. You know, I was getting an anxiety attack as I was reading it, actually. Difficult patients, staff problems, equipment failure. Yeah, it was all there. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and Robin, at this point, I'm just starting to wonder, is it a dental thing? I've always assumed, because obviously I'm going to say that my training at Sydney University, which seemed to go on for some time, was a walk in the park and a lovely, warm communal experience of learning, a community of scholars. However, I developed the view that perhaps dentistry wasn't meant to be a happy place, to paraphrase someone who I've momentarily forgotten, but it's not meant to be easy. Do other professions, as far as you're aware, have the sort of complaints that dentists have?
Certainly there's been some research looking at veterinarians, and they seem to experience, and I've just recently done some research, a similar sort of methodology applied to looking at neonatal nurses as well. And whilst the stressors, there are different stressors, there are certainly commonalities, because we're talking about two professions where they're dealing with people. And when you start looking at stress, occupational stress, when you've got an occupation that has direct contact with people, then you tend to find that there's elevations in that stress.
Do you have a perspective on that, Peter?
Well, look, potentially, I'd actually be interested to know if it's not just contact with people, but physical contact with people. I'm a little bit surprised to hear that it's similar for vets, and yet I guess we all love our pets. Yeah, I mean that would be a really interesting spot to investigate.
I think the other thing that's interesting is the differences. We did look a little bit around specialties as well, and those who came out less stressed, although there weren't big numbers that responded, but certainly the orthodontists came out as being far less stressed than other other specialties, and I also interviewed a couple of them, and they certainly come across as being much more relaxed.
So why did you include non-dentists in your study? Sorry about that. Are there any here this evening? There probably are. But there's no great surprise why orthodontists wouldn't be... Anyway, I won't go on with that. What about... Now, I've got to come back to this, but what do you think it is about electricians that that makes them want to...
Yeah, well, look, I don't know. I was quite surprised about that. Again, that's a US study that looks at that. And there were some quite interesting occupations that ranked quite highly there. But yeah, no, I'm not sure about the electricians. Maybe, again, they're dealing with people.
We might come back to that. Any other questions from the audience at this point?
Yeah,
yes,
thank
Dr.
you, Patrick.
Jonas from the far north coast of New South Wales.
It's very interesting from your survey that almost 5.5% of the people who responded found there was a fair bit of stress related with keeping your CPD up to level, and it's a reality for our profession these days. Now, did you find any causes for those stresses? Was it something simply like doing the CPD, actually turning up and doing it? Was there stress related to reporting it and keeping track of it all? Or was there fear of actually getting audited by AHPRA that created that stress?
Look, I think at the time when this survey was conducted, the whole CPD was relatively new. So I think it was more fear of the unknown than it was that any particular factor that you just identified. So yeah, I think and again, I think that would be something interesting if we went back and we reran the survey now, whether that would shine through as strongly. I think it really was associated with, at the time, that it was something new and there was a lot of uncertainty associated with it.
Did you find that other specialities were sort of more stressful than ortho?
No, not really, no. Like I said, we didn't have huge numbers, so it's very difficult to draw conclusions based on the specialists. Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll have to encourage them next time to increase their participation.
Anybody else from the audience here? Yes, Phil. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Jim.
I'm Jim Hawkins and I'm an orthodontist and I'm happy. Let's get that straight. It was interesting to hear your definition of stress, which I presume is the Lazarus and Folkman definition.
That is indeed, yes.
I have a son who's a psychologist. As one of the older members present, I'm just wondering whether you managed to glean out of your quite comprehensive survey whether, to quote Lazarus and Folkman, whether the demands of the situation exceed the perceived ability to cope, whether you detected any age-related part of that definition in your research.
Well, I'll answer that from two different angles, actually. One of the things when I had people calling me and people that responded as part of the actual, participated as part of the interviews, the older dentists certainly didn't appear as stressed as many of the younger dentists. A lot of them said, and they would often comment about, you know, I've been there, I've done that, I'm a little bit more relaxed about it now, I've built-in mechanisms to be able to better cope with situations. The other side of it was when we first sent out the survey. I mentioned before that we had a lot of people ring and speak to us about and saying thank you for doing this. And certainly a lot of older dentists rang and often said, oh, you know, how can we help? We'd like to be more involved, you know, possibly around mentoring. And I think that's another area that we need to focus on a bit more in the future, is how can we involve older dentists with the younger dentists in the profession? Because there was certainly a lot of goodwill there from dentists wanting to be able to give back.
And I might say that Professor Jim Hawkins is the ADA's representative on the Doctors' Health Advisory Service. And if you feel you'd like to speak to that service or you need help, 9437 6552, and we'll repeat that number later on. I'm not sure if we've run out of questions from the audience or not. Mr. Robert Boyd Boland, please go ahead.
Robin, I used to practice I practiced in a different profession. I'm just wondering, you talked about work and personal life conflicts. Did you find that dentists at the end of their working day were able to leave their dentistry practice in the dental surgery and therefore not sort of have that wake up in the middle of the night episode where have I done this or haven't I not done that or the like?
No, I didn't glean from the interviews that we did any sort of evidence that people really strongly carrying that burden home. It was more to do with when they discussed that interference with work and family associated with getting out of the practice on time and that commitment to their patients and being there, as opposed to carrying the stresses associated with home. Although many did talk about how when they did get home, the difficulties to be able to share the experience with, their partners. Yeah.
One of the findings, Robin, that interested me, especially having gone through having children, well, you know what I mean. It was not getting a good night's sleep, and I find that the last good night's sleep I got was somewhere in the middle of third year, I think. But sleep deficiency, more than a third of the respondents indicated they only occasionally or never got a good night's sleep. Is that something that other studies have found, or is that an Australian thing?
Admittedly, that really wasn't something that had been focused on in other studies, but it came out again from going around doing the interviews. And we thought we'd sort of throw that question in there, and we're quite surprised when that result came through, because certainly we know that lack of sleep does contribute to stress and obviously has a work health and safety influence that, linked to people being able to concentrate, and obviously practicing dentistry requires intense concentration, so there is certainly concerns within that space, and again something I think we need to delve in a little bit deeper and unpack in future research.
It must be difficult to construct questions where you really get to the individual concerns of people. I'm sure you're planning to do this again. What changes are you thinking of making?
Yeah, so obviously because this was the as far as I was aware, the first research within Australia that has looked at the various stressors for dentists, we sort of weren't 100% sure what other things we could be including. Obviously, we looked at the research out there, what people had done previously. We did the interviews to highlight what it is that dentists were feeling. But now that we've got these results, there's certain areas that have highlighted, as we said, around the family and work interference, things like sleep. All of those have become quite instrumental. So I think they're things that we'll need to probably look at how we construct the survey to embrace those areas further.
Pam, you've read the results of the survey and you've seen that. Can you think of any other things that stress you that are not in this study or they're not explored?
Oh, that's fairly comprehensive, I must say. No, I wouldn't say there was anything I would add, but one thing that I found disturbing was that so many dentists ticked the box that said, I feel life is not worthwhile. And I thought that was really sad and certainly highlights the need for research such as this and for services such as the dental health service.
Peter, what about you when you think about your whole life here tonight? That's a terrible way to put it, isn't it?
No, look, go for it.
Anything that you find particularly makes it more difficult to practice?
Look, I don't know about difficulty practicing, but a stressor that I would experience in a big picture long-term sense would be uncertainty about the long-term stability of the profession in terms of things like increased new graduates, decreased patients, corporatisation, skilled migration and interference from government and health funds. I think that they are some significant challenges for the profession to face, and certainly does give me some low-grade background stress about essentially my job security down the track.
How widespread is that? I'm going to use you as a foil for Gen. I don't know if you actually are Gen Y.
I am Gen Y.
You are,
yes.
so you'll
Don't
be
hold
off.
it against me. Apparently, it's a bad
Do
thing.
you even have a letter, Patrick?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
No. So you'll be off in a couple of minutes to do something.
I could be because my phone's buzzing and,
Yeah.
and I've got a better offer.
But tell me about. I mean, I think I've heard a lot of, and this is just anecdotal, that dentists my age say things like, "I wouldn't put my son or daughter into dentistry." Although I notice that the one at Orange in New South Wales seems to have a lot of dental sons and daughters in that group. Not quite sure why, but the sentiment is that it's not the profession that it used to be. Does that resonate with you, or is it something you have trouble understanding?
No, it resonates pretty strongly with me. I think at the moment dentistry has potential to be a very rewarding profession. My concern is that I just don't know whether that's going to last. So I've had to come to terms with the fact that perhaps, and look, this is a very vague possibility, but perhaps dentistry may not be a lifelong profession for me, which is certainly nothing that I had ever considered earlier in my career. I'm not saying that I have plans to move on, but I think we need to just bear in mind that with the challenges that the profession is facing, dentistry may not offer the security and lifestyle that currently it does.
What sort of effects does that have on a young dentist? What sort of choices are they making that perhaps I mightn't have made?
Well, look, I think a lot of younger dentists are focusing very heavily on upskilling as much as they can, which is probably a good thing in some ways.
You might be interested to know when I was doing the interviews that I said to dentists, if you weren't to be a dentist, what else would you do? And many of them told me they'd be property developers.
I think, Robin, some of the... I know people that have gone the Amway route, although it's called something different now. There's certainly property development is cattle farming to greater or lesser degrees of success. Certainly something I can relate to, which might bring me back to you, Dr. Gower. You have a kind of an interesting practice, and I'm sorry I keep making that very bad joke, and if people haven't seen the film then it'll go down flat like I did tonight. But what draws you back to dealing with the forensic side of life?
Well, it's fascinating. You can apply your dental skills and experience to a completely different field. So you can work with experienced forensic experts, with pathologists, with the coroner, and you're a little cog in a big wheel. And so you help with the investigation, and you help families that are grieving, have lost a loved one, and you can positively identify them and say, yes, that is, and then they can start the grieving process.
And you've worked overseas too in mass disaster areas?
Yes, I have.
And that, how many dentists go over and do that at a time?
We go in teams and rotating teams, so you don't spend longer than 2 to 3 weeks there generally.
And that must be good, having the support of those people.
Oh yes, we know each other well from working at disasters before.
I think a lot of us are very appreciative of the work you do, so thanks for keeping on doing it. One of the questions that's come in from our webcast is the difference between practicing in a rural environment and a metropolitan environment. I think you had more overall numbers from Metro.
Yeah.
Did you tease out any differences between those two groups?
Certainly when we were doing the interviews, discussions came up, and Peter might even want to jump in on this particular one. But certainly one of the things that I found interesting that a lot of dentists mentioned that worked in that rural setting were the stresses associated with having to be able to do everything. So if they're in the metro environment, they know that if they have trouble or something is beyond their abilities, it's easy enough to be able to refer the patient on. Whereas when they're in that more rural setting, they feel that they have to take everything on themselves. So yeah, I don't know whether that's...
No, I agree. My rural patients are much more likely to be resistant to the prospect of specialist referral, because Armidale is quite well looked after in some specialty fields, but at the same time there are other specialists for whom patients will have to travel, and I mean some patients just don't want to do that. So as as a dentist-patient team, we need to accept some form of compromise, which is unfortunate because, as we talked about before, dentists are all about trying to get it right, but it's just how it goes.
One of the questions from the web audience, Robin, is had you considered, I think you did, but if you could talk about, dentists have a lot of neck and arm and everything problems.
Back problems.
Is a person who suffers those physical stresses likely to suffer the psychological stresses as well? Is there a positive correlation, or they're not related at all?
It's not something we actually looked at as part of this research, but it is something that has shone through in some of the international research, so particularly looking at back and neck pain. Yeah, so it's not something that we actually looked at in this study.
In your career, your undergraduate career, Peter, did you get any instruction about what's likely to happen to you when you reach 42 or 43?
Look, it wasn't put in those terms. We did cover a few segments on ergonomics, and look, I think that was quite useful. There will be times when I've find myself slouched in a particularly bad position over a patient to access an upper 7, and those moments come back. Look, it's a busy course, the dental undergraduate course, and I did a 5-year undergraduate course compared with some of the shorter courses where they really have to condense, I assume. So I think it's a tough one to sort of pile in too much about ergonomics, and yet, you know, I guess it's something that might need to be covered concurrently with clinical tutors or demonstrators, trying to just sort of be on that as well, because at the end of the day, our body is our instrument, and if that goes, then we're going to be in trouble.
And how are you travelling? At the age of whatever you are.
So, that's very kind of you. I'm 32, and look, I'm travelling okay at the moment. You know, I try to do a bit of exercise to maintain that, but I'm under no illusions that it's going to be possibly a battle in time, because the positions that we're required to spend a lot of our working time in, our working day in, really are not that favourable to long-term physical health.
Thanks, Peter. One of our web correspondents, I'll direct this to you, Pam, wants to know whether a good quality dental nurse makes any sort of difference to your daily practice.
Oh yes, I think everyone would agree that yes, a good chairside makes a huge difference. And on those days where perhaps you're working with another assistant or a stand-in assistant, yes, you really notice the difference. By the end of the day, you're exhausted. You get that awful feeling like you might not have quite done a good job as you really wanted to. So I think it makes a huge difference.
And you made some references about some of the things, and I agree with you, in this study that were not surprising, but make you raise your eyebrows. But 33% of people frequently participate in physical activity. That seems very high to me. Do you get to do that every day?
Most days I do, yes.
Good on you. And how are you travelling with the spine?
Look, I'm fine.
Oh, God,
I'm fine.
Okay. Was there any more questions from the audience at this point? Yes, Dr. Thomas. Good to see you here.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, did you get any good leads in terms of resilience building for people? In other words, to counter the stress, were there some indication of what things people could do?
So again, that was something that more came out, and the opportunity to discuss was in the interviews as opposed to the survey itself. So when I was speaking to people about the stresses they experience, we did engage in discussions around what do you do to try and cope with those stresses. And a lot of it tended to link back to more those time and scheduling pressures. So people often spoke about strategies around putting dummy appointments in to allow them to run over. So it tended to relate more into that area than some of the other issues around, for instance, staffing. A little bit people did speak about with the stresses associated with running a business, going off and doing various business courses as well. To familiarise themselves in that space. And one of the things we did look at was how people coped with the stresses that they experienced, if there was difference in coping. And certainly we know from, which shone through in this research, but also in other research, that people's coping mechanisms certainly have an impact on those outcomes of stress as well.
I have another question from the audience.
Yes. Robin, have you actually looked at relating the stress to the expectations of the profession? In other words, what are they expecting from dentistry? As a dentist, you enter that profession. Why do you enter it? What do you expect out of it? Is it monetary? Is it skills? All those things. Have you ever thought about?
It's interesting you say that, because a body of research that myself and my colleague look at is around careers. And we're thinking of extending that into that dental space, because, again, linking back to the earlier question about older dentists and how they could participate more as they're transitioning out of the profession. So, again, it wasn't something we explicitly looked at in this research, but I think there's certainly scope to be investigating.
Anybody else from the audience? Yeah. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you. You mentioned that some of the dentists did expound on this last point with quite lengthy, sometimes A4 sheets of stories that they may have had. Can you elaborate on what some of that information, what kind of relevant?
Those comments were? Yeah, look, it varied. In some cases it was people, I guess, one that stood out, for instance, was someone who said to me they were currently going through a divorce, so they felt that may impact on their results. So therefore they're coming across as being more stressed than maybe they would have. People certainly went into other family circumstances that they felt that could have been impacting on their stress at that point in time. A lot of people spoke again about dealing with staff as being that real stressful issue. So picking up on what you said before about having a good dental assistant. So there was some quite colourful language when they spoke about how dental assistants don't always get on, and how dealing with those issues certainly was stressful. Yeah, so it was quite a variety, but it was more people often trying to explain what it is that they'd experienced in their practice in practicing dentistry that may have impacted on the results that they were giving. Yeah.
Robin, a web question. Are divorce rates higher for dentists as far as you know, or are we
I'm led to believe that they are, yes.
I can't imagine why that would be. We're all lovely people.
Might have to do with the work-family interference, which is why I think we need to look at that a little bit further.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And another web question was, and I think what they're driving at is, in medicine, for instance, we've seen shows where they do M&M conferences, mortality and morbidity, and they all discuss who pulled the wrong plug and put the wrong thing where. I don't do that. Do you think that that debriefing process, if it could somehow be organised for dentists, would make a difference?
Well, I think it goes back to the earlier question around isolation. So people having that opportunity, and certainly, as you've said, technology and younger dentists engaging in social media have, even if they're working in that isolated environment, can engage with people through social media. So I think to some extent that's changing, but certainly not for some older dentists. And I think having those opportunities to network, we know within the occupational stress research that having social support makes a big difference. So you can imagine, tends to with the occupational stress in the business environment, they'll look at, for instance, how supportive someone's manager is to their role. But when you're looking at a dentist in an isolated practice, that doesn't necessarily fit within this environment. But if you extend it out to the social environment, you can imagine that if they are going home and they've got a supportive partner who understands the environment in which they work, and it's not as easy just to walk out the door at whatever time they're due to finish, that makes a big difference to someone when you walk in the door and they're upset with you. So that certainly that social support is a big factor.
Look, I agree. I don't think it even takes to have the people around you as being specifically understanding of the pressures you're under. But I think having interests outside of dentistry and having just a generally supportive circle of family and friends is exceptionally helpful, because we all know that there are days when things perhaps didn't go the way we would have liked in dentistry, but the fact that that's not the be-all and end-all, I think is pretty therapeutic and healthy.
Robin, following on from that, one of our web correspondents wants me to raise the idea of mentoring. Now, by prefacing, what I'll say is I notice in the ADA is publishing a lot of guides to employment for young people, so it's kind of like a Facebooky kind of thing, and a lot of the new graduates are saying looking for a mentor. They didn't, I can't remember them existing in 1983, did we?
No.
I don't think so. I might ask Peter, is that part of life for young people, that they expect to be supported and helped by a specific dentist that they regard as a mentor?
I think we certainly hope to be. When we're graduating, I think we all remember feeling pretty underprepared, even though we had just completed however many years of study. So I think when you're out in the big wide world, it's very helpful to have a supportive mentor. I was lucky to have a couple of very supportive mentors in my early years, and I'm intensely grateful to them for their support, because sometimes things, well, you just needed some help. So, look, I think the expectation would be more of a hope that there's going to be mentorship, because I think that those first few years are quite formative and really very important about possibly how you'll feel about your career for a good long time.
Certainly some of the younger dentists brought up around the corporatisation of dentistry and what that meant for mentoring, because a lot of them spoke about what they saw as the more traditional model of once you graduated, sort of almost going in under the wing of somebody and they would sort of see you through, and then they might then decide to retire and you'd take over their practice, and feeling that opportunity was being lost to them. So that came through.
Whether that necessarily means that the idea of mentoring will be lost is questionable, I think. One of the practices I worked with about a year ago was purchased by a corporate entity, and there's I don't think there's really been any great disruption to the mentoring that goes on in that practice, even though there's been a change of ownership.
I think it's going to be a different way of doing it.
But certainly I agree. The transition from being employee to possibly practice owner, I think will change significantly.
Any views on that, Pam? Have you noticed a change in your area with just loosely corporatisation?
Yes, corporatisation. I think that certainly dentists our age in large practices have been approached by the corporates. For me, I'm not quite ready to go that way yet. I'm very happy and comfortable doing what I'm doing, and probably do that for quite a while. What I do think though for younger people looking for mentors, I think my fear of litigation is really strong, and I find it hard to think about mentoring a junior dentist, I must confess, because I know it's probably a noble thing to mentor a younger dentist. Certainly in the forensic field, I don't mind at all. In fact, I enjoy it, and I do quite a bit of it, but of course that is in the mortuary, in the health services, but not in my private practice. I tend to have dentists there who have many years of experience.
Robin, someone on the web wants you to address specifically, is there any data on burnout, and is that why dentists retire, or do they, perhaps I suppose the question might be, do they keep working even though they're burned out? And what do you mean by burnout? How would I recognise someone that's burned out?
Okay, so when we look at burnout as a concept, we break it into three areas. So we talk about the extent to which somebody feels emotionally exhausted. So that is, I wake up every day, I dread this feeling of having to head into work. The other area that we look at is the extent to which somebody depersonalises. So to what extent does the patient become seen as just a sort of essentially like another number, or just another face in the crowd, as opposed to identifying and having empathy towards that person. And the other is a sense of personal accomplishment. So when, and this is another area that shone through with when people spoke about the business associated stresses, that is that they would talk about the fact that when they've done a really good filling or an implant or something along those lines, they really feel this sense of accomplishment. But when I'm sitting out the back having to deal with staffing issues or I'm having to do my VAS, I don't feel like I'm accomplishing anything, even though obviously that's part of doing business. It's not part of their sense of accomplishment. And certainly what we found was a statistical relationship between those time pressures leading into a sense of emotional exhaustion, which also fed through into that reduced sense of personal accomplishment, and also associated with those business stresses, just reducing that sense of personal accomplishment.
Now, where to from here for you, Robin? What are your aims and goals in the next couple of years in this area?
So as I mentioned previously, this particular research, we always have to be very careful in drawing conclusions from what we refer to as cross-sectional data. So this was a one-off survey, and although this formed part of my PhD, I guess we're almost looking at this now as what was essentially a pilot survey. We've got a much better understanding of the stresses that dentists are experiencing and the issues that have been raised through this. So the next step is that we're looking to rerun the survey, and there will be some slight modifications to adjust from what we've learnt from this survey. But we do want to keep a lot of it the same because, again, we want to be able to make those comparisons. And I'd say to people that did participate last time, we did ask people to put their ADA number on. I certainly don't have access to that information. I'm not able to match the membership number to a person. It was simply about providing a unique identifier so that we can start comparing results over a period of time.
Thanks, Robin. And I'm pleased to say I think that the ADA is supporting the next phase of your work, so look out for those envelopes, or is it an online?
Well, it's interesting. Last time when we did the survey, when I ran around to interview dentists, I said to them at the end, the plan is that we will be doing a survey, and if you were to participate in such a study, would you prefer it to be online or paper-based? And many of the older dentists said to me they didn't believe it was real research unless it was paper-based. So we chose that time round to do a paper-based survey, but I think next time round we'll probably do a combination of both.
Good luck.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question if there is someone in the audience. Dr. Deborah Cockrell, you're new to the association.
I'm very interested in your comment about perfectionism and how we're all very fixed on what we do, and we want to do the very best we can, and we probably put ourselves under undue stress as a consequence. Just as a finish off, have you got any tips about how people can look at themselves and identify whether they are becoming too much of a perfectionist, and whether that might be an alarm bell to get them to think about the way that they're managing their lives?
Yeah, great question. One of the things you may have noticed within the report, we did look at the type A personality. So we know with people who are type A personality, they tend to be much more striving for perfectionism. They don't take as much credit or joy in achievements as well. So, and typically we've seen in research internationally as well that dentists tend to fall more into that type A personality. So I think for people that are practicing dentistry, this whole idea of striving for 100% of perfection, it's not always possible, and I think we need to sort of take a step back and say, sure, it's a great thing to strive for, but it's not possible, and not to be so down on yourself when you can't always achieve it. Yeah.
I thought that's what the whole point was, Robin. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Cockrell. If there are no more questions, I'd like to say that on behalf of ADA New South Wales, thank you for joining us for this evening's broadcast, to all of you. A big round of applause for my guests. The video will be available on the ADA New South Wales YouTube channel and in the coming days, and we certainly hope that you've enjoyed the broadcast tonight. We'd like you to click on the feedback button that you'll see on your screen if you're at home, and we look forward to seeing you online soon. Goodbye for now.
ADA New South Wales hopes that you enjoyed this evening's broadcast. Please take a moment to click the link below to leave us your feedback. This broadcast is proudly provided to you as a member service by ADA New South Wales.